So in a way, my paper, if you want to see it as a paper, not as a definition, is a long answer to Stathi's question to Nadia. What happens to democracy, or what does it mean for democracy to have crisis at its very foundation? What happens, in other words, when crises become normal? And I want to begin by describing a scene from this summer. It's a cafe at Tel Aviv, Saturday morning. People are sitting outside, having coffee or breakfast, as sirens go on. They all get up, some alarmingly, some less so, and find a place to hide. Some crowd in the bathroom or the kitchen. Some lie on the ground next to a wall, covering their heads with their hands. Some just stand there and wait next to the wall. After a few brief moments, you could hear several sounds of explosions. These are Hamas's rocket exploded by Israel's sophisticated anti-missile defense system, or sometimes just the missiles exploding on their own. If you're close enough to the site of explosion, the sky is partly covered with gray stripes. And for a moment, it might seem like a war zone, a minute war zone, if such a combination is possible. And I would argue that the very possibility of this combination stands at the heart of my definition of normal today. But this lasts for only a few seconds. Soon thereafter, people get out of their hiding place, resume their spots at the table. The waitress goes about with the coffee they ordered 5 minutes ago. The croissant is still waiting at the table, and the war is gone. Everything is back to normal. Now, of course, it is back to normal in Tel Aviv and not in Gaza, where the claim that war is normal takes a very, very different meaning. But this is a different story, or perhaps it is precisely the same story, and the underlying structure of violence that unites these two stories is central to what I want to say today, but I will get to that later. I gave a very early version of this talk last winter together with Merav Amir at the 10th annual lexical conference at Tel Aviv University. And in order to celebrate the anniversary, we, the organizing committee at Tel Aviv, decided on a special utopian concept. So instead of inviting people, like we always do, to ask what is X or what X has been in the history of concepts or the history of political regimes or how it partook in structures of oppression or discrimination, we invited them to draw on the lexical framework in order to imagine a different possible future, to rewrite concepts such as citizenship, to recharge with new meanings, concepts that seem to have lost their meaning, such as democracy or peace or hope, and to reclaim concepts that were abducted by other regimes, such as labor or productivity. So together with Merav, I wrote a definition of the concept, a semi-utopian definition. It wasn't really a utopian definition of the concept normal. And our claim was that normal is, and this is a definition if you'd like, normal is the utopia of spaces that are simultaneously provincial spaces, or I should say peripheral spaces, and would therefore simply like to resemble, to be like other place, like any other place, to be normal in this way. Places that are within permanent, more or less permanent conflict, spaces that are torn or struggling, and would therefore like things to be peaceful and quiet, and spaces that are under a permanent state of emergency, and would therefore like to move from the exception to the norm. This is perhaps why, when you ask someone in Israel how she would like to see Israel in the future, she'd simply say, I'd like it to be normal. As a utopian concept, normal is a very modest concept. It merely declares on the idea that we would like this place to be like any other place. But at the same time, like any other utopian concept, and in fact adhering to the very meaning of utopia, this other place does not really exist, because in their concreteness, all places have their own unique aberrations and abnormalities. So normal marks a classic yet trivialized political utopia. It is an other place, any other place, that must nonetheless remain a non-place. We could say that a normal state is a state which is not under a permanent state of emergency, that is given within more or less stable, recognized, peaceful boundaries, whose relation with its neighboring countries as well as its internal makeup are not under permanent contestation. It is a state that has managed to overcome, or at least hide well enough, the emergency at its foundation or its founding acts of violence. And therefore, it marks a classic liberal utopia. Or perhaps more accurately, it marks as a reality the phantasmatic utopia of liberalism. So what liberalism see as the fantasy of liberalism is marked by the use of the term normal, ordinary, everyday, like as a reality. A normal state, as a good state, is a state that is constituted by an act of agreement, a social contract, that has managed to monopolize all violent forces, subjecting them to the rule of law, thereby reducing violence to its bare minimum, the minimum that is necessary to defend the state and its population from external and internal enemies. And in Israel, this liberal simulation of utopian reality, normality, is best captured by the ability to hide or ignore the occupation. Now, I would like to stay with Israel, and you can see, you could see this focus as an attempt to point to an amplified and very clear example of the general and broad use of the term normal. You could see it rather as an almost arbitrary choice, which is an outcome of my own personal background. And I think this should be stressed out because Israel has become kind of a paradigmatic example for many things with no real reason. So there is a sense of arbitrariness there. But you could also, completely contradictory to what I just said now, see it as an analytical necessity. Because in a normal state, it would be quite difficult to uncover normalization processes. The normal there would be already depoliticized, part of the stable, regular order, woven into the ordinary operation of state apparatuses. In a state whose normalization efforts are still ongoing, such as in the case of Israel, it would be easier to identify normal as both an ideal and a political apparatus of the regime. And I have to put on the table one more disclaimer before I continue. This narrow focus, not just on Israel as one possible example among many other possible examples, but on this geopolitical meaning of the term, means that my definition here would necessarily be lacking and limited. In the original talk, Mirav and I moved between several fields in which the concept is deployed. We talked about disciplinary powers and the constitutions of norms, the normalizations of individuals, statistics, securitized violence, critiques of activism and normalization in activism. And this was done as part of a lexical movement, as it were, that seeks to float between different fields of meaning, draw together the different uses of the term, extricate their essence or their commonality, unify them under a single linguistic mark, the concept, right? Even if only to later then draw them back apart. So if a definition of normal in all these fields of application is called for, I would say that normal is the naturalization of power relations. And then we'll have to ask ourselves what is the relation between this definition and the utopian definition with which I started. So to mark something as normal, something like a relation or a state of affair or an object, to act something as normal is an act of depoliticization, of rendering its underlying power relations uncontestable, even unmarkable, outside the very realm of deliberation. And bearing this wider definition in mind, I would like to return now to the scene with which I open. So during the war on Gaza, as missile attacks occurred almost daily all over Israel, and I'm going to say nothing here about Gaza because I think the mere comparison is offensive. So when Israeli children had to run to the shelters several times a day, depending on their location, the Israeli Ministry of Education issued, or distributed rather, this striking booklet. And I'm sorry this is in Hebrew, but I will translate some of it as I go. The goal of this booklet is to help parents deal with the current emergency and equip them with tools to deal with their children's anxiety. Its first section is titled "To Feel Normal in an Abnormal Situation and to Start Functioning." Now you can see that normal and abnormal are given here in quotation marks. These already mark them as questionable concepts, or concepts with some unique meaning, and indeed their meaning is going to be inverted several times throughout the text. So the section begins with asserting that the current political situation, by current I mean Israel during the summer, is abnormal. And under such abnormal circumstances, it is said there, it is normal that kid would express abnormal feelings or will behave abnormally. So in an abnormal political situation, normal, both in its meaning as common and regular, but also in a way in its meaning as normative, shifts its content. Yet the booklet does not conclude with advising parents to be more forbearing when their kids express such abnormal, now normal behaviors such as being in bed or refusing to go to bed at night or being unable to function. It is rather asserts that the very acceptance of these abnormal behavior is a step towards restoring the normal, that is to move from stress to functioning. And to fold the abnormal situation back into the normal routine, a set of steps is introduced, whose goal is to introduce the signs of emergency into daily life, allow kids to be familiarized with them, and stop fearing them. So for example, it is suggested that parents would sing the sounds of sirens or play the sounds of sirens to their kids, or that they would make the shelters into a site of play, and above all, that they would maintain a normal daily routine. So to restore normality to the heart of the abnormal situation, right? Or maybe I should say this way. The goal here is that on the individual level, normality would regain its original meaning, even though it cannot do it on the more general, we can call it for a second, political level. Or perhaps it can regain this meaning also at the political level, and this is where I get to the crisis be normal part of the talk. Because war, I would argue, is the new normal of politics, and perhaps has always been. Because why is it so important that everything will be back to normal? Of course it is important because one does not want their children to be traumatized, but it is also important for the very preservation of a regime of a much greater violence. That is, it is important if war, as the new order of things, as the new normal, would be sustained. Because after all, if Jewish children and also Jewish adults want to be able to function under some levels of attack, war would have to be prevented. But then Israel would not be able to maintain its current regime, to which the control over the occupied Palestinian territories is necessary, as Adi and Ariela showed in their book, The One-State Condition. This is because after the militarization of Hamas, Israeli violence may result in missiles hitting Tel Aviv. So if Israeli violence, both the normal, that is everyday violence, that is encapsulated by the very control over non-citizens, and the more brutal, eruptive violence that itself becomes more and more normal, that is regular, given within more or less predictable patterns, almost circular even. So if these violences are to endure, and enduring them is a key interest of Israel, I think, a new mode of normality had to be developed that can contain violence itself without allowing it to interrupt life too radically. So to say differently, if war is to become normal in Gaza, that is common, regular, but not less importantly, uncontested, then war had to be normalized in Tel Aviv as well. This is perhaps why during the war the web was flooded with such espresso jokes. So this one says, to give a proper response to the next sirens, to the next missile attacks, the residents of Tel Aviv are now asked to only drink short espresso. So the espresso, which is the symbol of normality in Tel Aviv, had to be reconciled, if not harmonized, with war itself. We could give here a genealogy of normalization efforts in Israel that over the years took different forms, from peace process to separation, disengagement, but always pivoted the same principle. If a normal political existence requires, or indeed is, the obfuscation and concealment of the power relations constituting and preserving the state or the political space, then to live a normal life in Israel is conditioned upon the possibility to not think about or even actively forget the occupation. But instead of offering such a genealogy, I want to say that we don't need Israel in order to make the argument that I'm making, and that maybe even the historical framework that stands at the base of what I said now, war is the new order of things, is questionable. And to do both of these things, I want to say several words about Hobbes. And Hobbes would also allow me to revise and revisit a bit the original definition. So if before I argued that normal, in all its fields of application, can be thought of as the naturalization of power relations and of violence, Hobbes reverses the schema, a reversal that is ultimately, I shall argue, but a different formulation of the same claim. Because for Hobbes, normal does not belong to the state of nature, which is a space of chaos, but to political existence. It is the fruit, the outcome of a functioning political space, of a good Leviathan. So normalization can no longer be thought of as an act of depoliticization, but its principle remains the same. It is entangled with war, or at least with different kinds of violence. We can say that it remains war, since the state of nature has a persistent hold over politics, either as its schema of justification, as its threatening future or past, and due to its lingering presence within all political forms of life. But even if not war, then politics is, in Hobbes, is also not strictly peace. Because even at its mightiest version, the Leviathan does not offer a stable, peaceful existence from within, and certainly not from without. It is, after all, a large war machine, to deploy here Deleuze and Guattari. The fragility of peace means that the state has to be constructed as a security apparatus that becomes the foundation of political life. So normal, once again, appears as entangled with violence, even if very differently from what I argued before. Not as the concealment of power relations that seeks to hide the founding violence of politics, but rather as a political apparatus of power that can never bring the peace it pretends to achieve, that in this effort to enforce peace becomes a security monster which can always legitimately deploy violence, both within and without, and that thereby renders security to be the norm rather than the exception, as so many scholars of the field often say. The result in either analysis is similar. War, or different forms of violence, is the norm. And Foucault's analysis of politics in his 75-76 lectures at the Collège de France could allow us to make the same claim from a different direction. But if, as I suggested before, normal marks the form of political existence we desire, and if war is normal, or is the norm, then we would have to ask ourselves, in what way can we desire war? Such an analysis would have to take into account that we're not only willing to tolerate violence as a necessary evil, or deny its very existence, looking away, but that violence is celebrated, charged with political errors, or desired. Now, the question, what does it mean, or in what ways can we desire war, goes beyond the scope of the definition of normal, but it can, I think, allow me to refine it. So I began by pointing to the definition of normal, which I argued is a general definition. And it moved between three different strata. So normal, I argued, is the standard, the common, the regular state of affairs or a state of a certain phenomena, something we often use in the field of statistics. It is the natural, which we find often in disciplinary models, such as in psychology, psychiatry, or medicine. And note that natural here takes a very ambivalent form, because on the one hand, it is what is given, right, the natural given, and on the other hand, at the same time, it is what we should aspire to achieve, what we should conform to. And it is what remains transparent or quiet or uncontested, a meaning we find in many cultural and political meanings, and here I focused on the geopolitical one. These sometimes overlap and sometimes they do not, but all can be thought of via, this is what I argued at the beginning, can be thought of via the prism of naturalization. So Foucault, for example, argues that biopolitical systems rely on statistical distributions of things and people to mark the normal, in the first meaning, so to mark the normal patterns of circulation as natural. The state should thus allow these normal patterns to take their own course without political intervention. That is, to allow nature to regulate or regularize itself. Now, in the second definition, the natural is embedded in the very definition, and the quietness of the third definition, I don't have a better word. I'm sure there is a better word for that. I just couldn't find it. So this quietness, which is but normal's uncontested nature, can be thought of as depoliticization qua naturalization. But during my talk, the harmony between these three definitions began to disintegrate. Because we saw on the one hand that normal is, as I just said, the depoliticization of power relations. But if we think with Hobbes, then we cannot think of normal alongside the lines of nature. It is a certain quietness, in a way, that is the outcome of politics. But this quietness is not the standard. It's not common. It's rather rare, and some would say never fully achievable within politics. And when I talked about war as the new normal or the old normal or whatever, normal could certainly not take the third meaning. If we think with Hobbes, it is natural in the way that it belongs to the state of nature, but it is hyper-politicized in any other, I think, analytical framework. So we remain only with the first definition. So the concept keeps moving between these different definitions, and it's quite difficult to pin down its content. What remains, therefore, is merely the act. Normal is a speech act, a conceptual apparatus that does rather than means. It marks shift in content as simultaneously devoid of ethical judgment and desirable. As I proposed in the beginning of my talk, this combination in which the neutral and regular is desirable characterizes particular political contexts, and in particular sites and moments of instability, and in other moments normal can be thought of as boring and undesirable, right? In such contexts, normal, which naturalizes judgment, becomes essential as it allows conflict itself to be neutralized. It allows to think of conflict resolution not via the prism of justice, equal distributions of right or material resources, of past evils or future resolutions, but simply of obtaining more quiet, of having the conflict out of the way, even if in some political context this means preserving rather than resolving it.
So as Ann Stoller has argued, some of the most favored concepts of political theory acquire their critical force because they are not considered political concepts. Innocence is such a concept. Far from being an engagement with the regular stuff of politics, like power or the organization of collective life, the Oxford English Dictionary defines innocence as freedom from both the worldly and unworldly, freedom from sin, guilt, or moral wrong in general, freedom from specific guilt, freedom from cunning and artifice. Indeed, this space of freedom from, this negative freedom, is so free indeed that it's seemingly free of content. It purports to be a state of moral and epistemic purity. Innocence is defined as the state of guilelessness, artlessness, want of knowledge or sense. Indeed, it's a state of ignorance, even a state of silliness, in the words of the Oxford English Dictionary. Despite this formal definition of innocence that pits it against politics, I'll suggest that innocence is indeed a political concept, one that, either because of or despite of its very emptiness, has moved into the center of political life. My goal then will be to render it a bit more legible as a political concept, and I do this, to admit it, as a step towards doing away with the politics that it informs. What would the world look like without innocence? So first, I want to explore the genealogies and contours of innocence as a political concept. Then I'll give an empirical example of innocence at work. And I want to end with the idea of innocence as a concept that calls forth a form of colonial expansion. Okay. So innocence as a concept is at least as old as the story of Adam and Eve. We can trace it back through theological interpretations, such as a Robert South sermon of 1697, which asks, how came our first parents to sin to lose their primitive innocence? Innocence for Adam and Eve meant not knowing the difference between good and evil. It meant the lack of worldly knowledge. In the Garden of Eden, innocence is represented as a state of calm and repose before the fall of humanity when Eve eats from the tree of knowledge. The fall helps define humanity. That is, the loss of innocence is how we become human. In this sense, as philosopher Joanne Faulkner points out, innocence is inherently unsustainable, overdetermined by its conceptual history with Christian discourse. It's a mythical state destined to be toppled by humanity. Innocence also implies a lack of responsibility insofar as innocent life is bound by a divine authority. And the fall brings to human life a will and responsibility of its own. The story of Adam and Eve continues to resonate and shape our ideas of innocence. Recalling the Garden of Eden, Enlightenment thinkers such as Rousseau also imagined a time of innocence that preceded the social contract and the political life of citizens. For Rousseau, innocence is exemplified in the state of nature and conceived of as oneness with nature. Again, it's understood as a state of unsullied simplicity. There's a state where, for him, it's a state where human and animal are not clearly distinguishable. But as with this Garden of Eden, the departure from the state of nature is the beginning of our social existence, our start as political animals. Even in secular modernity, then, innocence is always something of the past, something to be recaptured by way of nostalgia, imagination, or longing. So insofar as innocence is a state of untroubled ignorance, it seems to precede politics. Yet I want to suggest that rather than name a state of epistemic purity that existed in the mythic or real past, as a political concept, innocence works precisely to produce an economy of knowledge and purity. That is, it regulates what counts as knowledge and what's understood as purity, and for whom. It does so to produce the idea of a deserving humanity, one that can escape the compromise and often corrupt nature of political life. Yet, as I will argue, in marking off a period of epistemic and moral purity, the concept of innocence produces worthiness, but only insofar as it is also a space of freedom from desire, will, and agency. That is, in valorizing purity, innocence produces humanity as a population of unknowing dupes. So let's look, for instance, at the most iconic figure of innocence, the child. The capture of innocence by the figure of the child reflects this search for purity in a secular world, this deep yearning for a time before corruption, a space beyond social norms. The child represents a mold of experience that's protected, controlled. It performs the part of tabula rasa, and as such offers proof that as humans we can be anything, that we are not condemned by our sinful past. Of course, childhood was not always considered the epitome of innocence. This is a modern invention dating to the 17th century. Following theories of original sin, which held that all humans carry the guilt of Adam's act of disobedience, children were understood as inherently sinful. They were small, faulty adults in need of discipline and correction, and the images of them at that time were dressed as little adults, not like this. John Locke helped us shift our notions of childhood as soiled by original sin by situating the child as simply a subject without experience and without memory. For him, the child was an instance of natural humanity, revealing humanity's capacity for knowledge and reason without being tainted by the prejudices of actual knowledge in society. The child was pure and uncorrupt potential. In this sense, Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers used the child to imagine a secular humanity. As its exemplar, the figure of the child enabled humanity to reimagine itself as also essentially innocent, that is, as having the potential to act and shape its own future. Locating innocence in the figure of the child, of course, leaves little space for actual childhood experiences. That is, what happens when these experiences don't fit the parameters of innocence. As a political concept, innocence carves out a conceptual space and time of unsullied hope linked to a freedom from knowledge. Yet the borders of this space are profoundly contested. Rather than a given, this space is a political battleground. Understanding innocence as a political concept means tracing which types of knowledge are named or counted as impure, and conversely, what experiences slip into a space of epistemic purity unnoticed. Child soldiers, for instance, trouble the image of the child as innocent. And indeed, as anthropologist Lisa Malky has argued, child soldiers are seen as an abomination, a category mistake that leads them to being labeled youth or teens whenever possible, to set aside and protect a time of innocence for children when they are still unworldly and untainted. Similarly, the undocumented minors crossing over into the United States from Central America this past summer were not categorized or treated as children. They were called minors, no matter their age, and imprisoned in detention centers. While child soldiers are sullied by their involvement in war, these undocumented children were tainted by their association with gangs, drugs, migrants, and violence. They were rendered complicit in these crimes by virtue of coming from the same place. As these examples demonstrate, rather than describing a state of epistemic purity, then, the concept of innocence helps to distinguish morally acceptable forms of knowledge and experience. And these forms of knowledge are inevitably tied to one's being in the world. That is, innocence is defined not simply by a period of life called childhood, but as we just saw, by class, gender, racial background, among other positionalities, histories, and experiences. Certain conditions enable the space for an unsullied childhood. Clearly, class formation is important here in configuring a space and time understood and recognized as pure, as empty or free of knowledge. But so is race. As Bell Hooks has stated, Black children in the United States, particularly Black boys, are never allowed to be children. Racial regimes mean that they are never allowed this period of untroubled or ignorant life. They're immediately interpolated into the structures and hierarchies of society, which render their knowledge suspect. A Black child cannot innocently pick up a toy gun, as we know from Tamir Rice. There's no space for such innocence, such unknowing. In this sense, innocence also produces and regulates ontologies. When one is a non-innocent child, one is no longer a child. One is simply expelled from the category. Looking at the way innocence is identified and embodied by others can also help us think about how the concept of innocence regulates a moral economy of knowledge. Unsurprisingly, those associated with innocence tend to be at humanity's edges. They mark its border in the sense that they are not corrupt, as is a normative humanity, nor are they fully human in the sense of having reason, will, or autonomy. And it's no accident, of course, that the example of the child here is with animals. Women have been figured as innocent, for instance, particularly in the form of mother and child. Yet long and well-documented histories situate chastity or sexual integrity as the most important thing about a woman, and in this sense, innocence is still inextricably tied to sexual innocence. As we know, sex is a particularly dense site of struggle between knowledge and ignorance. The term carnal knowledge illustrates the battle over how to categorize different forms of action and experience. For women, then, sex is considered the primary corrupting form of knowledge. To be innocent is to be chaste. This is echoed over and over again in the history of rape cases. Women who have been victims of sexual violence are figured immediately as guilty. The burden of proof is reversed, requiring that they prove their innocence rather than the guilt of their attackers. Okay, I'm moving now to the second section. So I want to turn to a specific empirical and historical example in order to trace innocence at work. I'm an anthropologist after all. I will suggest that the concept has become central to politics insofar as it creates a space for seemingly apolitical or morally pure action. So I begin with France in 1968 and the subsequent formation of Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, because it was here that a shift in the form of political engagement rendered innocence central to politics. I'm not suggesting it was the only moment that, or place this occurred, but it was certainly a critical one. 1968 marked the biggest strike in the history of the French workers' movement and the biggest mass movement in French history. The key players in the formation of Médecins Sans Frontières were all 68 heures, 68ers. They were doctors or medical students at the time and Maoists or members of the Communist Party. They included Bernard Kouchner and later Rony Brauman and Claude Moderator, to name just a few. MSF was founded in 1971 by these revolutionary doctors who came together with a group of equally radical journalists. Well, initially guided by the belief in a universal humanity grounded in equality and solidarity, MSF and the new humanitarianism nevertheless blossomed into and helped to shape an era of moralist anti-politics. After the failure of 68 to transform the social and political order, and after the disappointment of the anti-colonial revolutionary Marxist movements, Kouchner and many of his comrades from 68 changed their views quite radically. They turned away from engagement with what they thought of as politics and instead embraced the belief that one could only ultimately address individual suffering. In this sense, they attended to what they conceived of as universal humanity, composed of suffering victims. As a former executive of MSF USA, Nicolas de Torrente wrote, humanitarian action's single-minded purpose is alleviating suffering unconditionally and without ulterior motive. That is, politics in terms of the anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist revolution dreamed of by the 68 heures was replaced by a defense of the principles of human rights and by a view which separated victims from perpetrators, heroes from villains, in order to side with and defend the powerless. Kouchner and MSF brought a form of action that appealed in its purported ability to avoid Machiavellian politics. It was an ideology grounded in individualism, in life itself, one that no longer allowed for the possibility of larger political change. Innocence was central to the politics of this anti-politics, and ultimately central to defining morally legitimate suffering. The new humanitarianism was shaped by a frustration with and a refusal of politics, and consequently it was driven by the search for an uncorrupted space of action. As a political concept, innocence offers such a space of imagination, even as it calls forth and protects different versions of this kind of purity. In this sense, the suffering victim driving humanitarian action quickly inhabited the conceptual space opened by the notion of innocence, even as it was not always identical to it. While MSF maintains impartiality as a key principle, meaning that it offers assistance to people regardless of race, gender, religion, or political affiliation, in many humanitarian interventions, innocence became the necessary accompaniment to suffering required in order to designate the sufferer as worthy. That is, the suffering victim is best and most easily recognized by humanitarians when considered innocent, pure outside of politics, outside of history, indeed outside of time and place altogether. This figure is distinctly counterposed to the previous political protagonists of the 1960s and 70s, such as the worker and the colonial militant, and that they're both highly situated geographically, historically, racially, and of course politically. On a practical level, while humanitarians, and here I really am speaking of MSF, and that form of medical humanitarianism, so while they are guided by the principle of impartiality, in practice, finite resources limit their action. So they triage and they prioritize those considered in most serious and immediate danger. The concept of innocence helps in this process as a way to grasp and measure vulnerability. So let me give you an example of how this works. In my research on the role of humanitarian exceptions in the politics of immigration in France, I found that those who were understood to be the most passive, guileless, or simple-minded were the most likely to gain access to papers through humanitarian exceptions to the law. And this is just one example, rallying the sans-papiers, an example of innocence with the actress Emmanuelle Béard holding a child. This was to garner sympathy for the sans-papiers movement. So I spoke to a judge, for instance, who helped to decide on humanitarian exceptions to asylum claims, that is, claims that do not fit directly into the definition of a refugee, but are recognized nonetheless for humanitarian reasons. He told me about the kinds of cases he fought for and found most legitimate, and these included a gay Algerian who had been gang raped by 5 Algerian policemen, and an Afghani woman doctor who had been persecuted. In explaining why he found these cases compelling, he stated that he had no sympathy for the persécutés persecuteurs, so persecuted persecutors, people who are persecuted but have in turn persecuted others. He was looking for people who were not politically motivated. Ideally, he said, they would be passive, their hands not bloodied. Indeed, this is the very conceptual space of innocence. Humanitarian exceptions also increasingly included victims of human trafficking. As Carol Vance has long argued, the central characters in stories of sex trafficking are teenage girls and young women, putatively devoid of sexuality or knowledge, and sold into brothels. Indeed, human trafficking cases, a subset of which are called forms of modern slavery, perhaps best illustrate the need to appeal to innocence in the humanitarian logic. And they in turn reveal the contours of innocence as a political concept. Nearly all the modern slaves who were recognized and given papers through humanitarian exceptions were young girls who supposedly had come to France naively, sexually innocent, without a choice. There was no room for their complicity in wanting a better life or in taking opportunities to leave one's home, no room for sexual knowledge or experience. The girls were described as vulnerable, defenseless, lost, and excluded. As we can see from these examples, and as I already mentioned, certain subjects are better positioned to fit into the conceptual framework of innocence. Gender configuration suggests that women are more easily understood as victims and as apolitical, and hence more easily interpolated into the role of moral purity. But the third world woman, as transnational feminist Chandra Mohanty has called the stereotypical suffering victim of oppressive patriarchal cultures, is perhaps best qualified to pass the test of innocence, insofar as women from the third world or global south are often equated with passivity and apolitical corporeal existence. They are already seen as without agency and in need of rescue. Such gendered racial hierarchies nevertheless also serve then to qualify these women as innocent. In this sense, we see that innocence works to demarcate human kinds, purporting to value the most naive, the most inactive, the most childlike, while simultaneously setting up another class of people on whom these innocents must depend. That is, while innocence is valued, it shares its conceptual space with pitifulness. Differently stated, even as it creates a pure space for humanity, innocence creates hierarchies within that concept of humanity. Let me elaborate. So while the concept of innocence shifts according to the constellation of experiences and histories in which it's located, it nevertheless always carries with it the desire to protect and the impetus to take responsibility for those whom, in their want of knowledge, cannot take care of themselves. That is, guilelessness evokes the need for care. Innocents are unable to take responsibility for themselves. But this means that it props up a feeling of control in those who care for the innocent. Indeed, it assures them not only of their power, but of their knowledge, insofar as the innocent person is oblivious. Gayatri Spivak nicely described one instance of such action provoked by the idea of innocence and fed by the superiority in knowledge and power. She called it white men saving brown men from brown women. Sorry, white men saving brown women from brown men. Indeed, this is a script that continues to have enormous appeal. As a space of epistemic purity, innocence itself appears outside history, and as such, it allows those who work as saviors to ignore the political and historical circumstances that create these victims. Men who save brown women from brown men are allowed to ignore their complicity in creating a category of people who need saving. And they need never inquire into whether these brown women actually want saving, since as innocent, they are understood to be without desire and agency. Okay, so we'll move to the last section now. In this last section, I want to explore one more aspect of innocence as a political concept. As we have seen, as a space of epistemic and moral purity, innocence is always a work in progress. Insofar as there is no pure state of innocence, the concept derives from an imaginary or mythic past, I want to suggest that a politics based on innocence requires not only the search for, but the production of innocent victims, since the pure victim is always a placeholder, always just out of reach. As I mentioned, the recent focus on victims of human trafficking picture young girls or women who've been kidnapped from their homes and locked away in brothels. But this picture of innocence is complicated when we realize that many of these girls or women who engage in sex work actually chose to leave home and generally knew what they would be doing, even if they didn't know the exact conditions of their employment. Here, the victim is implicated in her own situation of exploitation, and her status quickly shifts from endangered to dangerous, innocent to delinquent. We lose her as an example of innocence and must look for somebody new. Forms of politics based on innocence are increasingly prevalent globally, not only by way of humanitarianism, but of course through the discourses and practices of human rights, and I'm sure many of you could name projects like the Innocent Project and so on, which use this as their way into the political world. Insofar as this type of moralistic politics depends on the figure of the innocent victim as the highest moral good, in an attempt to steer clear of explicit political solutions or goals, I want to suggest that the politics of innocence works through a logic of expansion in which new territories of innocence must be constantly discovered and incorporated. The innocent sufferer can never be isolated for long enough to keep it uncorrupted by history or context. In this sense, we're constantly displacing politics to the limit of innocence, a border which has to be drawn and redrawn. Let me give you an example. In January 2010, newspapers carried a series of stories about homeless Chihuahuas in California being rescued and flown to new homes around North America, from New York City to Houston to Edmonton. In one case, Virgin Airlines donated $12,000 in travel costs for the dogs and their human companions. These flights, termed Chihuahua airlifts, were organized by philanthropists along with the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. In one case, the New York Times wrote that 15 homeless dogs from the Bay Area were flown to JFK by the airline so they could be adopted by New Yorkers. And there are more articles as we go on. The storyline is familiar. The victims being rescued here recall poor women, innocent children. And like them, these companion animals are liminal figures at the border of humanity. And indeed, while animals are selectively incorporated into this politics of humanity in new ways, I don't mean to suggest that they represent a novel terrain of innocence. They've been variously included and excluded from the universal category over time. And of course, the other part of this is the flip side in a larger context is the overwhelming nature of institutions and practices like factory farming. But those are actually, in the inclusion, those are actually allowed to be excluded differently. So I want to suggest that there are new economies, technologies, and infrastructures that work to institute this particular incarnation of innocence. So let me give you another example. Days after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, humanitarian aid flooded in, but it was not just for people. A new set of NGOs came together to form the Animal Relief Coalition for Haiti, or ARCH, to provide medical assistance to animal survivors. ARCH said they treated 13,000 animals in the first 2 months and more than 50,000 during the year. Similarly, the American Humane Association conducted a large-scale animal rescue operation with its Japanese counterparts in Japan in 2011 in response to the tsunami and earthquake. This was part of an American Humane Association special animal emergency services program called Red Star Rescue, which goes to disaster scenes with experts, volunteers, and mobile resources such as their 82-foot truck and veterinary clinic, carrying rescue boats, emergency equipment, generators, food, and medicine. They were active in rescuing animals during Hurricane Sandy. Speaking of a politics of innocence, as you can see, the American Humane Association protects both animals and children. Their work in Japan and Haiti constitutes a first step into the international realm, aided by new communications technologies and networks that allow one to transport animals across countries and oceans. Indeed, they join a growing transnational industry and set of infrastructures for animal rescue, health, and protection. So I don't have time to go into it here, but not only are there new infrastructures to save innocent animals, there are new medical diagnoses for suffering animals, from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder to depression, new pharmaceutical companies that treat them. There are even new forms of criminality being created to protect this incarnation of innocence. For instance, in the US before 1990, only 6 states had felony provisions in their animal cruelty laws. Now 46 states do. In fact, several districts and states in the US now have created online registries that resemble those for sex offenders, tracking animal abusers across country and county lines. I just have to show this because this is an animal crime scene investigation trailer that from Union Square, right outside our offices, just to show that it has spread. So in this sense, I want to suggest that as a political concept that has become central to a politics of help, pity, and rescue, innocence actually encourages a form of expansion, not just in terms of profits, for instance, to be made from new subjects of big pharma, but also in terms of colonizing new landscapes to produce innocent victims, reproducing a certain sentimental political project of protection in the process. A predatory compassion, we might say. So let me just conclude. Many concepts are used to name and manage the border of politics and of humanity. As we know, of course, Agamben's Homo sacer describes a space at the heart of politics that's included by its very exclusion, a conceptual space that stands at once inside and outside of politics. Innocence is part of tangled convergences with other concepts, like Homo sacer, that also seek to manage and regulate distributions of knowledge and power, deservingness and blame, life and qualified life, potentiality and hopelessness. Nevertheless, as a concept, innocence works particularly well to regulate the meanings of epistemic and moral purity, and as such, to manage deservingness. And rather than function to demarcate life in general from life in particular, as a political concept, innocence must be recognized as broad-reaching, searching to include whatever it can in an always incomplete capture of purity. Innocence at once sets aside a space of life unsullied by knowledge or politics, and yet institutes a pathetic figure at the heart of this space. If we didn't fetishize vulnerability, purity, and simplicity, might we be able to avoid a politics of rescue, one that cannot help but produce hierarchies of humanity? Without innocence, might we have a different chance at equality, dignity, respect, or solidarity?
I have a lineup. I don't see anybody on the outer ring yet, but would love to. Max, start, and Nadia, and Aki. Oh, and Andreas, please.
So the animal question, I don't have much of a personal stake in this. I eat animal based on just an hour and a half ago, or part of it. But I do want to push you on this point because it seems to me that there's that what I didn't hear in your presentation is an argument for What I didn't hear in your presentation is an argument for why, just on its face, the phenomena that you demonstrated in terms of attention to animals should be interpreted in your way as a sort of a new economy of generating innocence as a source of compassion, rather than as a much more straightforward one, which goes back to Bentham. Namely, Bentham's project was to, say what you want about Bentham, but he's ground zero of the claim that we simply don't have the kind of moral categories that we would require in order to make substantive moral discriminations between human beings and animals, and therefore there's no good reason to exclude animals from the sphere of our moral concern. Now, Bentham attached that to a claim that was deeply critical of the kind of the sort of the secularizing theological idea of innocence that you're also criticizing. So in other words, you can get from here to there. I mean, you can fault these people on bad utilitarian choices, right? In other words, the resources should have gone somewhere else rather than an 86-foot kitten truck. I get that. But what I don't get is what the argument is for the view that the phenomena that you're indicating are better explained by your story than a straightforwardly sort of utilitarian account about the secularization and consequentialist recalculation of the sphere of moral concern.
Do you want to take a peek? Yeah, sure. It'll get lost in the
Thank you. No, I mean, I don't think it's either or. I think you're exactly right that on the one hand, this expansion is about questioning categories, moral categories. It is clearly about that in all kinds of realms, about distinguishing different forms of life. As we know, kind of great apes have been designated as having human rights, not just other kinds of rights. You know, there's all kinds of expansions, I think, of the category of life that's going on. On the other hand, I think some of the kinds of things that I'm talking about, these expansions of infrastructures and humanitarian infrastructures, they care less about animals, maybe as a different form of life, and more as pitiful victims. And I think they reconstitute them in that same mode. And so I guess I think I'm making a distinction between these kinds of saving organizations and organizations that speak about, in some ways, the humaneness of saving animals, and less about kind of a larger political project to kind of think of life differently, you know, in kind of a larger ecological realm. And part of it is literally the way that some kinds of animals are included in this project as opposed to others. So other kinds of projects might include plants, right? And they might include, this kind of project will only include very specific types of animals that somehow are able to enact innocence. And I didn't get a chance to get into the aesthetics of innocence, but that would be part of it, is how you can picture and imagine and relate to that kind of a victim, which has eyes in a particular way. I had images of photographs of dogs sitting on, they'd been scarred and tortured in various ways, and they resemble exactly the features, everything about it resemble rape victims. You know, if you can't, these particular ways, the aestheticization of this particular animal suffering, I think if you can't enter into that, you can't qualify for this same type of saving. That's not to say that it's also not part of a larger set of movements that question the categorization of different forms of life.
Nadia.
Yeah, I have a question for you. The first one is to Miriam, to go back again to this question, which is interesting. You never use the word docility. Innocence is a form of docilization. And in fact, all the animals you show, they are domestic animals. They are not wild animals. They are not tigers and lions. They are cats and dogs. In this sense, docility is the real issue here, which is a project of making somebody able to obey and to be tamed and to be a meekness, a construction of meekness. Is this helpful to your research, or is simply a curiosity? The other, to your question, is to do with the following. First of all, a comment. Short espresso is better than long espresso. So, in this case, it's not a good...
There's also the cappuccino option, you know.
No, I know. This is a joke. The question is that the more you were talking, the more I were thinking about order instead of normal. Because this is a question of order. Hobbes, you mentioned Hobbes all the time, order and disorder. The natural is not at all a question of normal. It's a question of condition of disorder to be tamed. Again, I mean, how much issue of order is your issue instead of normal?
Yes, I think that it's funny how it works with the order of an ordinary, right? It's the move from the order to the ordinary that somehow encapsulates normal in general. And I think in many talked here about today and in the past about how each concept is actually a cluster of concepts and you cannot just take it out of all the others. So order is there, but I think like if I had to draw a map, if such a map is possible, of like spatializing the concept, then I would have the order in the outer scheme and then the ordinary closer to the normal and then the normal at the heart of it. And I guess part of this also brings the question, which kind of kept bothering me as I was talking today and as I was showing these slides that I realized are all in Hebrew. Could I have done it in this map that I just drew? Could I have done it in a different language? You know, and if I couldn't have, what does it mean about the concept, and what does it mean? Do we think necessarily from given languages, from given locations? Could I have given this very same definition if I hadn't just come from Israel? Would normal take a very different meaning? So I don't know. Certainly with homes, like it twisted, it necessitates to actually do a better refining of this schema of concepts. So.
Thank you. That's very helpful, actually, docility. I think that's exactly right. It's a completely critical aspect to these. And I'm just thinking in response, again, this is helping me respond again to your question, which is that in these kinds of infrastructure and technologies and rescue operations, there is no space for the non-innocent animal, actually. And I'm thinking of the case of Travis, if anybody remembered. Travis was a chimp that was owned by, you remember Travis, yeah. He was taken in as a baby and raised as a child, and he, wore clothes. He went shopping. He drank wine and beer, and he was really treated as a human by his family. The father died. He kind of got freaked out a little bit, and at some point, a friend of the mother came over, and Travis attacked her and ripped off her face and ate her hands. And this was a horrible thing, but in trying to make sense of it, there was a policeman who came in. He shot the chimp. The policeman went and ended up being traumatized, having to take workman's compensation. They wouldn't pay for workman's compensation for him because you don't get it if you shoot an animal in the line of duty, only if you shoot a person in the line of duty. Anyway, it was a whole big case. They changed the laws. This guy got compensation, but in all of this, there was no space for the fact that this was a chimp that actually bit off the face and the hands. He was considered a human and a traumatized human. There was no space for him as just a chimp, which is not innocent, not pure, not anything, right? I mean, it was immediately anthropomorphized, both kind of in law and in sentimental kind of narratives. And only as such was it accepted, I think. So I feel like there's without the kind of question, the issue of docility.
But he didn't get compensation, so that he was not just anthropomorphized, he was turned back into a chimp that moment.
They changed the laws, so he did get compensation.
But at first he didn't.
At first he didn't, but then they kind of, as it were, encompassed him into that, and so that he became a person that would be, one would, yeah. So I feel like in that kind of case, you're right. It's the dogs, the cats, the charismatic metafauna, not the other kinds of things that are incorporated.
Adi.
So this is for Miriam. I take it that you are describing a really interesting shift within the realm of what I would call the moral. From something else, whatever it is, to some kind of politics of innocence. And I would like to question this regarding MSF in particular, because I think that MSF exemplifies just the opposite of what you described. At least it did exemplify this when I was interested in following it closely, let's say a decade ago. MSF treated the perpetrators, not only the victims, yes. and withdrew in very few cases from the scene or the sites of disasters only when it understood itself collaborating with the regime that perpetrated the disaster. So the other reason being safety of the crew, but this is a different issue. I understand this as operation under a logic of disinterested interest in the suffering of people, in which the only category is urgency, the basic, the most, the guiding principle is urgency. Not who is innocent, but who needs help most urgency. So if what you are describing is true to MSF, it means that we are losing this kind of moral regime for another. But I'm not sure that maybe it's true for animal and I don't know, rape or other things. But I think that there's still a space in which humanitarians are working under the older logic.
Thank you. No, I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, I know that that's their, those are their principles, and I think they do work like that for the most part. But I think when it gets to the touchier, kind of blurrier situations where vulnerability is not as apparent as somebody bleeding out on the floor, right? That's when this kind of a thing comes to play. And I did see it with MSF's work in France itself, at the same time that they're also treating the perpetrators. But they don't treat the perpetrators when the perpetrators act like perpetrators, right? So they still have to be taken out of that particular space. If they saw them acting like perpetrators, as they did with Rwanda, they pulled out, as you said. So I think that, you know, as long as they can keep up the appearance in some sense of innocence, in the sense of just suffering without action, then they can be treated. But the moment that they are more than that, I think then MSF does question, right? I think they always have. So I don't think it's a shift necessarily in what they do. I think this is always embedded in it. And even in their work, particularly with victims of sexual violence, they've been very clear that it was very difficult to treat survivors or victims of sexual violence as humanitarian subjects because they didn't appear innocent. They actually wrote that in one of their books. And so they understand the need to somehow configure victims as innocent, even though they have this commitment, of course, to any kind of suffering.
I don't like to say make your questions short, because actually the questions are such wonderful interventions and they're so important. But we have 9 people on the list for 15 minutes. And it's really all up to you, whether you just like to cut that list in half and just let us talk the way we need to talk, or you want to get everything in. What's people's sense? No, but we have to, sorry. I'm going to try to just truncate them a little, your questions. So I'd like to just take Andreas and Jason and Jay. May I do those 3 together? Thank you. Andreas.
I very much like your argument, because what you are presenting is a deployment of power by constructing a particular subjectivity as innocent. So that's fine. But I think what is missing from your narrative is the legal dimension. Legal, you know, you go to the courts, you are proven innocent. So here we don't have a desire to protect. Here it's the desire not to be persecuted with no reason. So I'm wondering, because sometimes the legal, the political, and the moral can overlap, but the legal was absent. If you introduce this, if I don't have, let's say, the protection of the courts to prove my innocence, so I will not want to be innocent because I will be afraid that there will be a humanitarian intervention as soon as I'm found non-guilty. How that will fit into your argument?
Thank you.
All right, I'll make mine short too, because I think it's similar kind of terrain as Andreas' question. So, Miriam, sorry, this is to Miriam too. You know, what struck me is that you're focused on the innocence of the victim. In other words, when you're doing an analysis of innocence as a political concept, in this piece, you're really looking at those who suffer from power or are being dominated in some ways. And it seems that one important way to think about innocence as a political concept is the self-proclaimed innocence of the power wielder. Now, as somebody who does American political thought, like the idea that innocence is not a political concept just seems ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely essential to the discourse of American exceptionalism, for example. So you have people like Niebuhr, people like Arendt, who are very critical of the way in which innocence gets wielded by power holders because of the lack of curiosity, self-reflexivity, the sense of disavowal of being implicated in power relations, the way in which any opposition or disagreement is framed as kind of a part of a demonology, is absolutely outside. So I'm just curious to hear you say something about how flipping the analysis from innocence to those who suffer to those who wield power changes or impacts the argument.
Great. Jay.
So a short question for each of you. Hagar first. So I was dissatisfied with your speech act ending. And the reason why is, it seems to me that normal, order, and the term you began with, peace, are systematically ambiguous, and a Speech Act intervention is the wrong one. That is, each of them build into themselves both a quieting, docilization, normalization of power, and have a utopian dimension. And they can only be disentangled politically, contextually, and practically. And I don't think there's any way of avoiding that. I think that's built into the concepts. To Miriam, I think the range of questions, beginning with Max's, go back. Rick Schwader has a smart, famous essay where he goes through kinds of moral discourse. And he says there's only one kind of moral discourse that cannot achieve any modernity, and that's the discourse of purity. And the question is how to do that critique. And it seems to me you've mobilized all the wrong concepts. We want to hold on to suffering, to vulnerability, to dependency, that these are actually fundamental natures of our political condition. And it's to associate them with the discourse of innocence, of course, is where the takeover occurs. But the trick is how to claim them without repressing the reality that there is such a thing as vulnerability, there is such a thing as dependency, etc. So it seems to me that you, by coming for the language of respect and all that, you try to cover over the difficulty of the terrain.
I'll just be happy with your dissatisfaction. And I think what I was trying to do is to say that in particular context, and of course there would have to be a greater analysis to show how it changes in others, the Speech Act does exactly what you're trying to do. So I completely agree.
Miriam.
Yeah, then briefly, yes, of course, the juridical aspect being left out. I didn't have that much space or time. That said, I'm not, well, they're different. I think, for instance, something like the Innocence Project, which tries to exonerate people, due to their DNA or other evidence, uses the idea of innocence because of its moral weight. They don't say we're the project to exonerate people because of their DNA, right? I think that there is a moral dimension to the juridical, as you're saying, anyways, and of course it needs to be explored. And I think in the case of, say, Eyal Weizman makes a case that the idea of innocence, even in humanitarianism, is changing and becoming more technical, more of a juridical concept. It's simply about not being party to kind of you're not actually complicit in that act, and there's a way to define it, or you are. If you happen to be there, then you're complicit. So it's technical and legal things as opposed to anything about sentiment and so on. So I know there's a whole space for that. Yes, thank you. Flipping the analysis completely, I think I tried to do that a little bit by pointing to the role of humanitarians themselves and what they get from it, which is that they get purified in some sense by the act, and I completely agree. The idea of you can't talk about anything here without thinking racial innocence, as James Baldwin says, is the innocence that white people claim because they don't want to deal with the racial regime that we're a part of. So yes, absolutely have to deal with that. And to Jay, I mean, it's a fantastic point. I do want to chuck out all those things. I do want to chuck out vulnerability and dependency and all those kinds of things, but we can't, I know.
I thought, after being nervous, why would you want to fight that particular vote?
Why would I want to chuck all that stuff out?
Yeah, you have to bite bullets somewhere, as Foster would often say, but why not? Why checking out what seems to me to be like absolutely indispensable?
Because I don't see how they can be leveraged in any way that doesn't kind of make them complicit with these other kinds of things. I just think, feminist theory has tried it over and over and they keep failing. I mean, I don't see a way to recuperate them. Even as such, I think there are theories of dependency or vulnerability, ways to talk about it, but I wouldn't use those terms. I think I would need another set of concepts. Related, but not exactly the same. I think they're mired in,
To be continued. I'm going to jump the queue, not for myself, but for a student, so make sure that we get at least one student back.
He looked, yeah.
Wait a minute.
Your best laid plans have gone to
Ask
waste.
a question. Please, may I jump in for a moment? Thank you. That was just a compliment.
Hi, Miriam. So I have a question it's related to Andreas. So in criminal law, the social criminal is presumed innocent. The burden of proof is to prove that he's guilty. However, in political criminal, he's always guilty. He has to prove that he's loyal and that he is not a subversive. That's all.
You're going to help me with this.
Tim. And then Linda.
Thank you. Actually, I heard you, Miriam, doing something like an analysis of a certain sort of dispositif. In other words, the emergence of a new political regime, which I recognise to be true, which is, I mean, one sees it in. I mean, Tony Blair was probably the most obvious marker of that. I mean, he campaigned on trust essentially, and so everything that you said in the paper about the construction of innocence, I didn't take it to have anything to do with animals particularly. So I was convinced by it. But now you've said that you want to chuck out all these other categories. I thought you were doing something like an ideology critique of a political formation that you yourself were not particularly invested in. So I just want to sort of ask you to clarify a bit of that, because I mean. And to ask you what your positive understanding of the political realm is. I mean, Arendt is probably the figure who's most categorically excluded the entire realm of morality and the good from the political. So where is Arendt, someone like Arendt, for you?
That's a difficult question. Do I answer?
I wait one more. Linda, right now. Yes.
This will be a follow-up of some of these points, but I heard both of the papers as talking about the sort of function that both of these terms play for state legitimation, colonial legitimation, white supremacy legitimation. So you can't have an abnormal condition as the everyday condition of a state and it be legitimated, and innocence is, you're showing all the ways it plays this role. So I wondered if that was a correct reading, but if so, then yeah, I had a similar question about MSF, because MSF does not play that kind of role vis-a-vis a particular state. But the other question follows Jay's, because I was going to ask you, and I think you just answered it, whether you think there is a way to salvage some aspects of this effort. If the term innocence is so loaded, if innocence becomes the price of protection, clearly this is problematic. And it seems to me to be about agency, often especially in sexual violence cases, among others. But if there's any agency involved on the part of the victim, then they're no longer a victim. Whereas for many children, for example, there can be agency involved. And so perpetrators that take advantage and influence agential actions of children, I mean, it's even more horrendous, as much of the empirical research shows. But there are other cases of children who are 3 years old who are not agential in the act at all. So, you know, we need some kind of way to characterize these kinds of cases. And if the word innocent can't be used because it will be taken up in this other way, I mean, I guess I'm not convinced that we can really have a non-recuperable theory. We can show the way that things get taken up and recuperated, but can we really have a quest to establish a theory or a discourse that's not going to be recuperable, right? And so I'm wondering whether you think there's any positive program that might be salvaged after your critique, if not for innocence, for some other term.
That's another book.
Answer. Thank you for, yes. I guess it's back to Andrew's question of what's the positive program? What's the answer in some sense? I wouldn't say I'm an Arendtian, but but I would try to minimize the role of moralisms in politics. And, you know, obviously Rancière has been somebody who critiques that particular position as well. You know, I actually think, you know, in response to, again, thinking of Jay's point, that a lot of, again, feminists and feminists of color and so on have critiqued these ideas as well, and not to do away with any idea of relationality or, you know, of idea of collectivity, but precisely because they bring with it these hierarchies all the time. So I'm not going to give you a clear kind of set, but these are a number of the people that inform the way I would think about how to create a different future with this. I mean, on the one hand, it is a critique of ideology. On the other hand, it is also kind of trying to put forward a different way. Yeah. And the salvage effort. Yeah. I know. I mean, obviously, it's important, right? We can't. There would be a lot of people who would. There would be a lot of injustice without some kind of concept. I don't know exactly what it would be. Yeah.
Dimitri.
Bring the concept of innocence in politics. But I think that here we could make some distinctions, and I wonder whether you think it will change the kind of politics we might think about. One is the kind of innocence which is based on lack of reflexivity, of not knowledge, kind of spontaneity. And this is what is mythologically called state of nature by Rousseau. Well, people in the state of nature don't know they're in the state of nature. When children are little, they do certain things without knowing that they shouldn't do that. And so as they grow, they sort of lose their innocence, they become responsible. And the other model of innocence is, it can be either moral or legal. For instance, I know that I'm innocent, and I can prove it. Or for that matter, there is also presumption of innocence. If somebody accuses me of stealing a cookie, and I know I didn't do that, I can prove it. I know that I'm innocent, I have a proof. Right? So these are, I mean, two different kinds of innocence, irreflective and reflective.
The non-student in that.
Hi, this is to Miriam as well. I see this, the definite politics of innocence and its relation to the creation of passive subjects and docile subjects in the politics engaged in that. I'm wondering if there's a counter history to that as well, where actually innocence is the precondition of agency. And I'm thinking here of Nietzsche, and particularly the Antichrist, where his depiction of Jesus is actually of beyond good and evil, in the sense that this is an innocent person, innocent of the state around them, the laws of that place, and just acting spontaneously with his passions of what he believes he needs to do, as the condition to be a free spirit, to actually have authentic agency in the world. I'm wondering if there's other traditions that actually take the notion of innocence and tie it to agency rather than the trajectory you've traced out.
I actually only have room for one more. I'm sorry, raise your hands too late. The last one is actually Emily, and the time is way beyond up.
Then I'll make a quick comment, and maybe I can bargain a little my time over someone else. It's really about the implication of the animal-human language. I think there's a whole rhetoric that wasn't taken on in your presentation, a relationship between hunting and rescuing, where they really start to conflate. And I was thinking of Grégoire Chamaillou's book on the manhunt, and the whole synergetic practice of organizing human parks, animal targeting, right? And this kind of complicating your argument about innocence when you're when you're targeting Johns, say, or perpetrators of animal cruelty, but you're using the very same techniques as you are hunting aliens. And there's an imbrication, and it extends into this question also of what's shelter and what's a detention center.
We're going to take those very short ones back there, those two, yes.
Actually, just tagging on with what Emily was just expressing is how does innocence relate to the burden, right? I didn't hear that word. The burden of the rescuer, in this case, or another way to frame it would be the responsibility to protect. So how does then innocence become a mobilizing force? Which is something that might help tease out maybe this particular formation of innocence with some of the others that have been raised in other questions.
Thanks for taking me. Miriam, I'm struck, if I remember correctly, you ended your paper with a citation from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You said something about dignity? Am I totally mistaken?
Yeah,
so, and I was wondering, because since 1948, we have been guaranteed equality and dignity by virtue of birth. Right, by that declaration. It says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So I'm wondering, if you're getting rid of victimhood and innocence, why do you want to bring back dignity? I mean, what is it about dignity that's better than innocence? Thanks.
Should I answer?
If you like.
There's not too much. Thank you, Dimitri, for that. That's really helpful. I think making those distinctions is actually obviously very relevant, so thank you. The counter history with Nietzsche, I think that is embedded in the idea that I was trying to portray, which is that, like Rousseau and others recuperated the idea of innocence precisely as a way to be able to act in the world, right? Because with the ideas of original sin and so on, one is already condemned, right? One cannot have free will, one can't act. So this was an idea precisely to recuperate a freedom from social norms and the social order, and to be able to act differently, which then Nietzsche takes on more, but I think innocence, the way it works in our world, wasn't taken up that way. So I do think you're right, that there might be another way to recuperate it. I don't know if it's too late. Just to Emily, thank you, that's very smart. I would like to talk to her more about it afterwards. And dignity, the issue of dignity, why dignity? I don't follow a human rights regime, a genealogy of dignity that would go through human rights. I would think of a different genealogy of respect and those kinds of things.